What are we talking about today? Two Seikos that we don't hear enough about, the King Seiko and the Lord Seiko. Hi guys, everything's coming up pumpkins. Everywhere we look, it's pumpkin mania. This is one of my favorite times of the year, hence all the pumpkins during today's intro. And today's coffee is Madcap. This coffee is really good and it deserves a brief spotlight because it's so thick and syrupy and loaded with chocolate spice. This is a really good blend and the first time I've had it. So cheers. So a lot of you are aware that I've shown Grand Seiko a lot of love on this channel, and rightfully so. But there are also two Seikos that we don't really hear or talk about a lot because they're not made anymore, but they are accessible. So we're going to talk about the King Seiko and the Lord Seiko. So let's begin with King Seiko. There are also a lot of us who are aware of the history of Grand Seiko being introduced in 1960. And Seiko wanted its two manufactories to compete against each other in a friendly rivalry. So King Seiko was born in 1961. They had their two plants, the Suwa Sakosha and Danny Sakosha, compete with each other with a simple goal, and that is to make the best watch with the most accurate movement. And most of us are also aware of the continued success of Grand Seiko, but regarding King Seiko, well, they sadly perished in the 1970s. However, we can still find a King Seiko online on eBay. I think the average price is around $600 depending on the condition. I think I might have seen one for about $1,200 for a really minty condition. And what makes these beautiful King Seikos extra special is that they use Seiko's high beat movement, which means that they beat at 36,000 vibrations per hour versus the standard 28 in most other luxury high-end watches. And everything about these King Seikos are made in-house. And if we can snag one for $600, we would be owning a really fantastic and one of the best looking and best made dress watches out there. Even today, very few companies use a high beat movement. So if we're able to grab a King Seiko for a few $100s, that would represent a tremendous value. And for a Grand Seiko-esque, dare I say it? Do it. Grand Seiko-esque watch. And what I mean by that is both watches, the King Seiko and Grand Seiko, were meant to compete against each other on the same level. So we know we can still have a King Seiko serviced by Seiko, and the average cost of a service cleaning is $700. So if we can find a King Seiko for $600, we would drop $1,300 on a newly conditioned and clean King Seiko, a watch that represents absolute beauty and quality, making it a tremendous value. And there's something else worthy to note. Even though King Seiko perished in the 1970s during its first decade of its birth, Grand Seiko also went into hibernation regarding their mechanical movement for about 24 years. And then they resurfaced in 1988 back with the mechanical movement. So it's interesting to wonder what would have happened to King Seiko if it wasn't for the quartz boom. If that watch would have continued or maybe even have replaced Grand Seiko. It's just something that makes you go, So what is the significance of the names King Seiko and Lord Seiko? Well, they were used to represent the hierarchy of the Japanese businessman. So if you were the man, the CEO or president, you'd be wearing the Grand Seiko. And if you were in upper management, you'd wear the King Seiko. And if you were in lower management, the Lord Seiko would be for you. And it would have been a misrepresentation for anyone at the lower level management to be wearing a King Seiko and so forth. Let's talk about Lord Seiko. And one of the interesting things about Lord Seiko is that they use the caliber, the high beat mechanical movement. I think it's a 5740C. And what's interesting about this is that I think a lot of people thought that this movement would have been reserved for the Grand Seiko, but instead it was for the Lord Seiko, which is for lower management. The Lord Seiko is 35 millimeters and 41 from lug to lug, and the lugs are neither fat nor skinny. This watch wears really well for a 35 millimeter watch. It reminds me a lot of the Rolex DJ36 and how that fits well on most wrists. I mean, if you look at this watch, this is just a really beautiful fitting watch. And we can get a Lord Seiko for between $200 to $500. And again, this can be serviced by Seiko. So for under $1,000, we can own a newly conditioned, newly cleaned Lord Seiko. Now I want to point out that the newer watches on the Seiko website that's called Seiko Lord, I think it's called, it's not the same as the vintage Lord Seikos. Those are entirely different watches. The Lord Seiko watches are more of an inexpensive lineup for Seiko. It has nothing to do with the actual Lord Seiko, or I think the actual title of the Lord Seiko is Lord Marvel Seiko, but those are two entirely different watches. I'm a really big fan of Seiko, and while neither the King Seiko nor Lord Seiko represents any horological significance, Seiko was considered an outcast by most Swiss brands, while Grand Seiko was considered a real threat to them. So for that, I really appreciate both the King Seiko and the Lord Seiko. And while King Seiko and Lord Seiko were used to identify the certain level of success for a businessman, that still carries over today because a watch is an ultimate status symbol. But now, even if we're not in upper management, we can still own a King Seiko, and if we're not quite yet in middle management, we can still own a Lord Seiko. Thanks for watching, thank you for your time, and I'll see you the next time. The King Seiko was produced 1 year after the Grand Seiko, so in 1962, wait, that's not how math works. If the Grand Seiko was produced in 1960, the King Seiko would have been produced in 1961. Come on, Rich, you're better than that in math. I wonder if they made a Queen Seiko for the female. Don't use that, that's cheesy. The Lord King Seiko. Lord Seiko. Slow it down. Lord Seiko.